recently I have been working on a doctorate of ministry, and I have been studying dreams, many dreams in the Bible, the creative arts, and process theology. Process theology is this God that is not a supernatural God. It is not the depths of the pit of the whale of atheism. It is the God of relationship, of potentiality, the creative force, the God who, as our children's sermon talked about, is as near as a touch, as a smile. And I've been paying close attention to my dreams. And recently I had a very odd dream. I had a dream about a whale. And it was a green whale. And it had legs. And it was spit out onto the beach. Well, I went to Google. And I Googled green whale because I thought there's no such thing as a green whale. And what came up was Greenpeace. And what I read about were the blue whales. And I read about how the blue whales of the Antarctic are less than 1% of their original abundance. The West Pacific gray whale populations are the most endangered in the world's great whales, hovering on the edge of extinction, with just over 100 remaining. And endangered whales have many obstacles to face. Global warming, pollution, overfishing. We know all these things. Whales have been here for 15 million years before we got here. Now, Jesus' teaching that we heard today about doing unto the least of these, doing unto all of those that are powerless or have less power than others, is such a central teaching to us as Christians. And we must see the power over relationship in our relationship, in where we are in that power relationship, in all of our relationships. And particularly now with our ecological crisis, to our entire relationship to creation. We must see this and wake up and become conscious so that we can begin to make amends and learn to be sensitive to all of the creature's needs. I was so delighted when I came here this morning, and I looked for a cup of water, and I went to your water cooler, and I pushed a bunch of buttons and I couldn't get it to work. Someone came to help me and they said, oh yes, this is a new kind of water cooler that is going to be bringing us water out of the thin air. So there's much hope, even though there is enormous ecologic devastation. And I think our spiritual practice is to grow hearts as big as whales. And one of the things I learned when I Googled whales is that the blue whale, the biggest mammal that has ever lived on the earth, their heart is as big as a car. Can you imagine this? That's big. And I was thinking that this is a good meditation for us, to think of our growing our hearts and connecting with these whales, and growing our hearts so they could be as big as whales, symbolically. The way we ignore the suffering of others is the way we ignore the suffering in ourselves. And the way we grow hearts as big as whales for our own suffering equals our ability, I believe, to have hearts as big as whales for others. The story of Jonah and the whale is about an ordinary man, just like all of us. And like you and me, he lives in a culture that has very difficult problems. And in this wicked town, he is called by God to go preach, because wicked things are happening there. But what does Jonah do? He does what many of us do. So, no, thank you, God, I don't want to do that. It's just overwhelming. It's just, it's too overwhelming. The water problems, the war problems, the ecological devastation. I think I'm just going to go on an escape. I'm going to get on a boat. This is what Jonah does. And he goes, and then he gets thrown overboard, and he gets eaten by a whale. And in this pit of suffering, Jonah begins to feel God's presence. And that is the way it is for many of us, that we don't feel God's presence often until we are in the pit of despair and suffering. And we are reminded in our Christian story and all of the beautiful stories of the Bible that God has been present with us in all of our suffering. You know, I was thinking that the wickedness of this town that God has called Jonah to go preach was somewhat like Penn State. I was listening to this on the news, I'm sure you were too, where there were terrible, terrible things happening, where children were being raped and other people were ignoring this and not protecting them. And I was reminded that children in our world are like the endangered whales. They are the least powerful, and we have to stand up and we have to care for them. But the way we ignore the suffering others is the way we ignore the suffering in ourselves. So when we can feel the pit of despair in the whale of Jonah, feel our own pain, when we can have compassion on our own pain, when we can learn to have hearts as big as whales for our own suffering, that will equal the amount of compassion we will be able to have for others. Now, the fish has always been associated, as we know, with the Christ, the symbol of the Christ, the Holy One that lives under the water. And like God, it is something that is massively all over the earth, but is often out of sight. It is something that is there, but is something that we cannot see. Dreams about whales have been very prolific for me, and I see them as a kind of a symbol of my original self before the bruises and hardships of different times in my life. And these whales have surfaced to show my divine self, that it is alive and whale. Whales are coming out of the water of my consciousness. Water is often a symbol of our unconscious in dreams and in the Bible. And after dark passages, these whales guide me to regain my stability. The whales I see in the bright sunny day in my dreams are a sight of power and hope. But only because I have done like Jonah. I have felt my own pain when I have been in the pit of darkness, and I have had a large heart to have compassion for myself. Terrible things happen, and other people often see these terrible things happening, like at Penn State, and do nothing. And I believe this is directly correlated to all of our ability to not have compassion for our own selves. I was thinking perhaps of naming this sermon title, Jonah, Jesus, Jerry Sandusky, and Joe Paterno. But I decided no. Anyway, we got to have more women, more girls in the story. And I thought of a wonderful whale story that has been very meaningful to me, and I hope you've seen this movie, The Whale Rider. Have any of you seen this?
Yep.
Oh, good. Jerry's seen it in the back. See this movie. If you have Netflix, order it. It's a very beautiful story. And it's about a young girl who has a calling to be a religious leader and teacher. And of course, she lives in a culture that has never had women as religious leaders. And so she is rejected, and she is done great dishonoring. And the story of their peoples is that Pika was like Jonah, part of the very early story of their beginnings. And he rode a whale from Hawaii all the way to New Zealand. And she is a direct descendant from him. Well, the story goes that she is not allowed to be a religious leader, and she calls upon the whales for help. And they actually hear her, and they come, and they beach themselves, and they're in terrible danger because they cannot, of course, live on land. Then she gets on the largest whale, and like Pika, her religious ancestor, she rides the whales, and then the entire pod follow, and she is then down in the depths of the water. And after this, having sighted her as the whale rider, they have now nothing but respect for her and allow her to be their teacher. One of the most powerful scenes in this movie is when she is hoping to give her grandfather a special privilege by inviting him as her guest of honor to a program where she is going to give a talk where she has won many awards about the history of Pika and the whale rider, but he does not come. And you see in this scene that she stands on stage and she presents this beautiful story and she weeps the entire time. And I couldn't help but think that it is like being with Jonah, being with the whale rider, in the pit of the stomach, that when we have the courage to feel our pain, to express it, to share it with others in community, that God is with us and we do move through these times, and that we are able to resurrect. One of my colleagues said to me that they were so sorry about this Penn State story because the children's lives had been ruined. And I was really upset by this comment because that is not our religious story. No one's life has to be ruined. And many psychologists have come to teach us this, that children could go through horrific things, but if there are adults there who can bear witness with them, who can tolerate their feelings, who can walk with them, that they indeed can experience a resurrection. They can, like Jonah, be spit out and be beached and continue to follow God. The whale rider calls upon the spirit of her ancestors. This is language from indigenous people. What we call it is the Christ. It is no different when we call upon the Christ. We are doing the same thing that indigenous people do when they call upon the spirit of their ancestors. And the spirit of Jonah and Jesus and the whale rider are with all of us, always. Now, I had a dream on a full moon last year that I entitled Whale Rider. And the Gestalt idea of dreams is that everything we dream is about ourselves. There are many ways to think about and talk about and express dreams, but in this dream, I think of all aspects of this dream being about myself. And I invite you to, what we do in projective dream work, to invite you to enter my dream and to live my dream with me, to imagine it as I'm sharing it with you. In my dream, I am in the front seat of a passenger car, a green car, and a woman is driving, and I don't know who she is. I do not look at her, or in any case, I don't recognize her. We are parked on the beach, looking at the ocean, looking out, and we see a huge, beautiful whale swimming south. And I see that her spout is big, and skin is black, with barnacles all over. And then I realize, wait, she's even bigger than a whale. She looks to be as big as a skyscraper, and she continues to grow and grow and be so massive I can't even see the end of her. And the woman who's driving in the car, she drives out onto the water and she drives onto the whale's tail. Well, I'm terrified of my dream, but the whale seems to know that we're there and seems to be very careful as it swims south. And the whale begins to give us a ride. We are riding on a whale's tail in a car. And the way we ignore suffering of others is the way we ignore the suffering in ourselves. And the way we grow hearts as big as whales is the way that we will be able to alleviate others' suffering. So in my dream, I'm being driven by a woman I do not know. And in the landscape of dreams, this is often the Holy One that is a witness that is always with us. In order to save the whales, in order to save the children, in order to save all of those who are in power relationships where they do not have the power to act for themselves, is for us to begin to heal the inner child within ourselves, to heal all those ways that we have been wounded. And that will give us the strength in order to stand up in solidarity with all of those that are the least of these, that are the most marginalized, that are the most in need of our love and care. Inside this pit of suffering where Jonah has this horrific experience, God is there with him. God is in relationship with all of us. We must learn to love all of those wounded places within ourselves in order to go forth into the world and do what Jesus has called us to do, and to do unto the least of these.